Great. So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited about our topic today. We're really going to focus in on banking or not banking, marijuana related businesses. So as we are all virtual and not together there in Vegas this time, what we need to do is make sure that we put together the faces with the names and the voices. So another layer of connecting the dots here. So rather than me doing the introduction that we would normally do in person, I'm going to ask each one of our panelists to do a quick introduction before we jump right in. So Sundi, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Holly. I'm Sundi Seafried, and I'm the CEO of Partner Colorado Credit Union and also the founder and developer of the Safe Harbor Private Banking model. We've been banking CRBs since January 2015 and 6 months of preparation prior to that. We have endured 15 state and federal exams since 2015, and so the program's had a lot of scrutiny, but we are presently processing nearly $3 billion a year in cannabis-related funds, hence the scrutiny of the regulators. Thank you, Holly.
Great, thank you, Sundi. And so then, Jim, I'm going to move over to you.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, Jim Richards. For the last couple of years, I've been the principal and founder of my own consulting firm, RegTech Consulting. Prior to that, I spent about 13 years as the BSA officer at that little bank on the West Coast known as Wells Fargo. In addition to being the BSA officer, I was the global head of financial crimes risk management, which included internal and external and fraud, customer due diligence, anti-bribery and corruption, sanctions, AML, BSA, etc. So happy to be here.
Great, thank you, Jim. And last but not least, Steve, if you can introduce yourself.
Hi, thanks. Steve Kemmerling, the founder and CEO of CRB Monitor, which I started in 2014 to help financial institutions understand, identify, and manage, we'll say, cannabis-related risks and opportunities. For better or worse, the guy who came up with a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3 framework that some people hate and some love. So.
All right, great. Thank you, Steve. And don't everybody get jealous about Sundi having 15 exams. So look, this topic continues to be a very hot topic, right? And no, not just because of the topic itself, but because there's a lot of discussion around it from an industry perspective on what do we do? Do we take on this type of risk? What guidelines are we following, et cetera? So what we're going to do here today is really start to dig in. And as you just heard, right, we have an excellent panel here that has a lot of expertise in this field directly. So this is a great opportunity for us to dig in. There will be a Q&A session at the end. So also a really great opportunity to take advantage of the expertise that you have here on the line. So we're gonna jump right in and get to it. So I'm first gonna go to Steve because this is critical as we start to talk about this topic. Is Steve, what we see is the landscape is very different state to state, right? And it continues to change regularly and, well, opposed to this year, usually at a very fast pace, where some states are allowing medical, some states are allowing recreational, some have both. So it can be very confusing, right? When you start to look at it's not a one size fits all. So first off, I guess most importantly, is how are you seeing that landscape evolve? And then also, how can you keep up with those changes to make sure that you're, in a spot from a regulatory perspective to understand the different laws?
Yeah, absolutely. It's been interesting and fun and head scratching watching this industry evolve since 2014 when we started the company. There was, I think, 9 or 10 legalized states at that point, and I was just checking my numbers before the call. And now we're looking at, I'm tracking 37 states that have medical or recreational marijuana, plus DC, plus 4 US territories. And as you stated, there's they're all over the board in terms of recreational or medical, or even more nuanced things like smokable marijuana, flowers versus not smokable, or vaping versus not vaping. And then you throw in the additional curveballs from the past 2 or so years of hemp and CBD. And there's a lot going on. It's a patchwork of various 50 states, 50 different sets of rules and regulations. And really, as a practitioner, fundamentally, if you're operating in one state, I guess good for you. You only need to know that one state. Try to be up to date with marijuana agency. You can sign up for newsletters from the marijuana agencies in many, if not most, states. But it is a state by state challenge, right? So obviously anyone who's operating in multiple states would need to understand that, and I'm sure somebody could potentially speak to that. But it is definitely a patchwork, and generally there is no single source of information other than, frankly, a handful of third-party vendors like ourselves and maybe some others who are really trying to aggregate and put all of that information in one place. So it's tricky because it's medical in some states, recreational in other states. I think we were looking earlier, and there's something between the 10 to 12 states that are in the act of trying to pass legislation, or executive orders to expand with the state laws. So it is a challenge to keep up with, but really it's watching the news, knowing what's going on in the jurisdiction or jurisdictions where your institution is operating.
Yeah, and I think that's important, right? Is that not only is there different, different laws state by state, but also different ways that they're communicating that information and data out, right? So it's not somebody doesn't use the same Excel file to distribute this information state by state, right? So I think that's a critical piece. The reason why I wanted to start there is because it definitely kicks off the rest of our conversation, right? On how do you manage to that? One of the big things that, comes out of that is, and you alluded to it, right? It's not just understanding one state, it's then you have a flow of money, right? That's going between states, that's flowing cross borders pretty easily. So Sundi, can you talk to us a little bit about that and why it's so critical to understand the different state laws, just given, the flow of money?
Yes, I'd like to say 2 things on that. The first thing I'd like to point out is that the FinCEN guidance gave financial institutions the ability to align with each state. That doesn't mean that we become the regulator of the product. It doesn't mean that we have to know every regulation surrounding every issue in every state. What it means is that we can rely on the state and their licensing procedures and their regulatory environment to manage to the state expectations. We can't be watching the money and watching the product at the same time. Just to give you an example, very early stages, the regulators came in, probably our 3rd exam of 15, and they expected us. They sat down across the table from me and said, we want your bankers on site at all 200 dispensaries every year doing a risk rating of those dispensaries. And I look at them and I said, there's no way we can do that, nor anybody behind us, because every time I send my banker on site to risk rate something they don't understand 100%, but they have great understanding of the business. But they certainly can't risk rate the regulatory environment of each dispensary. And that came out of the exam very quickly, because every time they don't want our eyes off the money. Our job as financial institutions is to protect the financial system. And every time we take our eyes off the money and distract ourselves, we don't fulfill those BSA obligations. The second thing about flowing money through the states I want to talk about is you have to start with the very first thing, which I would believe is, what is the regulatory environment within your state, and is that a legal operation within your own state? In other words, if you are a state in which only medicinal is legal, can you really pass money that is recreational or adult use into that state? Just to use an example, Idaho doesn't have anything legal. Do the banks, and should the banks actually bring money into that state, because Idaho considers it an illegal activity? And I think that this is going to be an issue for financial institutions when and if the Safe Banking Act ever gets passed, because I have worked closely with Senator Crapo's office on this very point, that you have no right to bring money into your state if the money isn't a legal operation or blessed within that state. So I think that if the product is legal, the money is legal. I think money can flow across the borders. I have no problem with that. I have an issue, and I think that our law enforcement will eventually have an issue with the fact that you're not watching the regulations within your own state and the legality of the product.
So on that, I mean, there's a lot, right, to keep up with. How are you ensuring that you and your team are staying up to date with the different regulations coming out, and especially, understanding the different state to state rules?
The best way to understand the state rules is what we do during due diligence. I've often said it takes our clients 2 to 3 weeks to onboard with us, because part of that process is us tearing through their state applications and learning everything the state requires of them. And so that is our best education. But that's not upon what we rely for our own safety and soundness. We engage local counsel in each state so that they can keep us above reproach and make sure that we know anything that is changing within the regulations that would impact banking. But once again, I will say that even when you get to the legal level, we have a right, based upon FinCEN guidelines, to rely on the state, as well as the state has a right to rely on us for protecting the financial system.
Perfect. I'd imagine a few people wrote that down for a couple times for reference. So look, I think, we started to touch on it a bit, the regulatory landscape. Jim, I know you're passionate about this, so I'm going to pick on you here a little bit. So this year, right, we saw, dozens of cannabis policy reform bills being introduced to the different state legislatures across the country. And a lot of them, fairly high confidence, would get passed, right? And then here we are, COVID hit. Everything took a bit of a pause, just given their sessions, and some paused, some adjourned. So can you tell us what you think we'll see coming in the next session? And then probably most importantly, what do you think is going to be required from the policymakers and the regulators to help financial institutions navigate this a little bit better?
Wow, I think that was 3 questions, Holly. So first of all, there was a really interesting Congressional Research Service report that was published about a week ago on September 4th, and it was titled COVID-19 and Emerging Patterns of Global Financial Crime. But they sort of dropped a statement in there I thought was interesting and is really relevant here. And that is, one of the risks is there has been a reprioritization of scarce government resources away from AML and CFT. I think the same thing can be said for that reprioritization of scarce government resources away from cannabis, hemp, marijuana as well. A lot of the states have been very distracted, appropriately so, around the response to COVID, whether it's the public health response or pandemic relief type responses, et cetera. So that has really distracted both sort of the state and the federal level. But we have this little thing called an election coming up in November. And that is, the entire House is going to, everybody in the House is up for election, a third of the Senate, and obviously the Oval Office. So, and then a lot of states are obviously have, whether it's constitutional referenda or whatever it might be. I think, Sunday, you had mentioned there was 11 states, I think, have cannabis things on the ballot, whether it's for what I call medicinal. Steve, you called medical marijuana, and I use the term adult use rather than recreational. But there's various adult use / recreational ballots coming up in November as well. And then a lot of the laws or the bills that have been introduced, primarily in the House, but to a lesser degree in the Senate, like the Safe Banking Act, the MORE Act, and others that have stalled. So depending on what happens in the election, we're going to see an entirely different environment. But what we are all hoping for, one way or the other, whether you are a proponent or an opponent of cannabis, is certainty. We need to get some certainty. And so one way or the other, I think this election will provide us with the certainty that we need to manage risk. Because if you don't know what the risks are that you are managing, or the severity or likelihood of something happening, it's very, very difficult to have a program in place that will withstand the retrospective look that regulators and prosecutors will put on your program in the future.
So Sunday, based off that, right, and your expertise and the fact that you're doing this in practice today, based off of what Jim said, do you think that, I guess, what are your comments around that as well, right? Because you've had to work within the guidance that's today, but certainly I agree, right? There's a lot of folks out there hoping for some level of certainty to be rolled out, I guess.
Yeah, Jim makes a really good point there in terms of certainty. And I have to say, we've been operating in an uncertain environment for the last 6 years that we've been doing the program. And we've had to make things up, and that's the very issue. 10 banks can pick up the FinCEN guidance and have 10 different interpretations. How can regulators go in and regulate financial institutions when there is no standardization? And that there is a problem, because you have some institutions who will go in, cut corners, get into the market just to gain market share, and not think about the ramifications that the black market exists and that you have to do enhanced due diligence, and this is above and beyond BSA. And yet the regulators can't go in and make their business decisions for them. So regulators have no standardizations amongst themselves to which they can hold banks and credit unions accountable. And I think eventually there's going to be that standardization, but I think there's going to be a little chaos in between. And I think some of those financial institutions that are jumping into it will find themselves with certain situations. And if they think they're going to count on the Safe Banking Act, Safe Banking Act does nothing to alleviate BSA obligations. It's not the legal environment that might be my board fears the most. It's FinCEN. It's the BSA environment that we have greater fear, because those fines are severe and could really take a financial institution to its death if BSA is not done correctly.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to kick it over to Steve, just kind of on that note, right? As we talk about making sure that it's done correctly, Sunday, you alluded to it, right? There's a lot of opportunity, especially in this environment, for people to get very competitive and maybe jump in without having all of the right controls in place, so to speak, but just to gain some market share. Steve, one of the things that you and I have spoken about a few times, right, is we've both been in different financial institutions where it's there's no certainty. So my stance is we're just not going to do business with any marijuana related businesses. Now, I think we probably need to ensure that you have the same due diligence for not banking MRBs that you do as you decide to take on MRBs, right? You need to make sure that you've got the right policies in place, because you want to make sure, if that's your policy, that you can catch those and make sure that you're not doing that, right, even unknowingly. So what's your experience been as you look at, the financial institutions weighing, do I not do business with, or do I do business with?
Yeah, I think Sunday hit on a lot of the key points around we're working with, to say the least, some imperfect information, and even if SAFE is passed or further regulatory expectations are refined, it still takes time, I think, fundamentally, to figure out what that means in practice. I think it's not too dissimilar from the concept of PEPs, the 90s and 2000s. Jim, feel free to tell me if I'm way off on that comparison, but that's, you can come up with a definition, but then it still takes time to implement and standardize, across the board. So what I do see is words matter, and you even heard on it just a minute or two ago between myself and Jim, both two people who know the industry, I would say, more than the average Joe, and he's using terminology that's frequently used or is used in California, medicinal and adult use, whereas I might say just recreational medical, because that's what I started using 5 years ago. But I think the most important concept is, does the institution have at least some basic definitions and frameworks off which they're basing their policies? And then based on those policies, do they have any procedures or controls to enforce those policies? So frequently what I see is institutions or compliance officers, and rightfully so at this point, potentially muddling or confusing terminology like cannabis or marijuana, because it depends on, to some degree, it depends on who you're talking to, but there also are legal definitions for these things. Marijuana is legally defined, hemp is legally defined, etc. So what I see a lot is people say, well, I have a very strict no marijuana policy, but then they don't really at least contemplate really concepts like indirect or ancillary, or what I would call tier 2 or tier 3 marijuana businesses, or beneficial owners accounts being used to fund and or receive profits from marijuana businesses. Usually often the response is, oh, well, that's not what I meant. To which I say, well, what did you mean, right? Did you write down what you meant? So ultimately it's, as Jim, I think, would say, words are important, definitions are important. They're evolving. Maybe we aren't all working off the same glossary, but at least have, some written definitions, written policies. It's really becoming more of a cannabis policy with sub-policies for what I will say was marijuana or hemp or CBD. So basically it's, do you have clear definitions? Do you agree what you're talking about? Do you have policies that mirror to those definitions? And then finally, do you have controls or procedures that actually match to policy? Because those of you who know me, it's almost 95% of banks have a no marijuana policy, but then do they actually have a procedure or control to effectively identify, manage, or mitigate those risks? Which I would say still the large majority of institutions don't really do so, in my opinion.
Great. I think that's key, right? What policy do you have? Does it match your, what you're doing internally? Could you identify them based off of your policy statement, right? That's certainly key. I think that also lends itself to, making the decision just banking marijuana related businesses or not. But then there's another area, right, that needs to be focused on, that's going to cause you to do another level of due diligence. And Sunday, I'm looking at you. I guess you can see that on the camera maybe. One of the areas of focus on is third-party payment processing, right? So there's an extra level of due diligence now that you need to look at based off of, payment processors, fintechs, payroll companies, that do deal in cannabis. So what do you see as key actions and focuses that you need to take there?
Great question, Holly. I talk about procedures and policies. I wrote a 50-page procedure on payment processors alone. We've had to rewrite 20 to 25 policies. Everything touches cannabis in the organization. So every policy, and I often teach everybody that, especially board members, policy is your first line of defense. Without solid policies, you have nothing to defend yourself with if you ever get to the prosecution level. Anyhow, as it pertains to third-party processing, we're talking about payrolls, we're talking about fintechs, we're talking about anybody who's processing payments through your financial institution. And there's two sides to this equation. And many people, as Steve spoke to, they don't know their banking, but have they looked at all their payrolls and their payment processors to see if they're actually facilitating payments for the cannabis industry because that's where it gets complex. Now they have additional BSA obligations at that third party level. So when we are banking a fintech or a payroll company, we have to know their customer's customer and prove it. We also have to prove that that third-party payment processor has a sufficient BSA program to protect the financial institution. In other words, what are they doing to make sure that those payroll companies and third-party processors are actually looking to see that those licenses are active and granted by the state every single year when they're renewed? They have to have something in place to protect themselves and to protect the financial institution. So here's a good takeaway. We came up with a registration program. So every time a payment processor or payroll company wants to enter their client or their customer into their pool running payments through us, we ask those questions about, have you verified the license? Are you in a compliant bank program? Are you, all the different things that we think we need to know to KYC sufficiently for payment processors. The second part of that equation is, to what location, to what financial institution are you facilitating payments to? Are you sending cannabis money to a non-compliant bank program? If you are, nobody's validating those funds against licensing activities to make sure they're legitimate funds entering the financial system. So here's another takeaway. You need to make sure that on the receiving end, that there is a compliant bank account to which those funds are being directed. That will ensure those funds are being validated. And it's a very important part of the process, because when you're a payment processor, it's just coming in your organization and out of your organization. You have the BSA obligation if somebody else isn't watching that money and validating it, and you want some piece of paper with an officer's signature on it that says, we have a compliant bank program, you can count on us, we're validating those monies. So there's several questions you ask in that side of the equations. You know, you have a compliant bank program. How many times have you gone through exam? You know, certain things to give you sufficient comfort that you have a defense that you went out and verified. Now, is everything going to be 100% accurate all the time? Are you going to be 100% protected? No. But all you have right now is a good faith defense. So every document that you produce, every document that you complete is part of the protective mechanisms you put in place to protect the board, to protect the officers, and to protect the financial institution.
Look at that. We're giving you takeaways, giving you notice when to write down the notes in advance. Thanks, Sunday. So Jim, as we were going through this dialogue, you know, prior to the panel, and we were all just talking, one of the things that you brought up was it also isn't just financial institutions, right? You also need to consider some of the other points that this is touching, like equipment leasing, strip mall retail, etc. So can you comment on that aspect as well?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about, you know, are you going to have a policy to do business with cannabis businesses? And it's that do business with is a very, very broad term. So here's a takeaway. When you're sort of putting your policies and procedures together, you have a spectrum of cannabis-related businesses. You've got Steve Kemmerling's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 type businesses. You've got employees of those businesses. So there's a spectrum of risk. The second dimension of that spectrum of risk is around the jurisdictions. Which states are they in? To Sunday's point, if it's just a medicinal or medical cannabis jurisdiction, that's one thing. If it's a hybrid where it's recreational or adult use and medicinal, that's something else. So understand the jurisdictions. The third dimension of your policy is around the products and services that you would be offering to those spectrum of entities in those various jurisdictions. So, for example, if you're doing equipment leasing, it might be okay to say, yeah, we will finance a photocopier for a tier 1 cannabis business. We're okay with that. which is very, very different than having transactional accounts, cash management, payroll accounts for a tier one cannabis business. So doing business with is a very, very broad term, and I think you really need to understand that. You mentioned the commercial real estate. You could be financing a strip mall, and there's 19 businesses in that strip mall. One of them is a cannabis business. Well, there's case law that says that entire lease, that financing deal that you have, you could forfeit that entire thing because of the illegal business that's in that strip mall. So it's really, really complicated. I'm going to add one other or two other takeaways on the policies and procedures that Sundi talked about. For those institutions out there, the BSA officers, et cetera, that are watching this, make sure if you have a prohibited business policy that we will not do business with cannabis, stick the word knowingly in there. We will not knowingly do business with those, because you probably are doing business with them. You just don't know that you are. So make sure you have that. And then also, I think you need to make sure that you can follow the Mike Tyson rule of procedures. And that is, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the nose. So take a look at your procedures. Are they so complicated that human nature simply will not allow you to adhere to those policies and procedures that you have? Make sure that your procedures and policies can withstand getting punched in the nose, the reality of doing it, and that they're not that complex that you can't actually, implement your own policies. So you never thought you'd hear Mike Tyson.
I was just going to say, I'm going to steal that now.
Steal away.
And I will be using that reference at some point, I'm sure.
Steal away.
So that's great. No, thank you for that. And it's funny, as you were saying, the knowingly, you may have caught, I've been trying to cover that, whether you knowingly or unknowingly, in the comments as we go through this. I think that's key, and certainly is important.
Yeah,
So,
I think, because we saw in the PPP loans that there was a number of those that came out. And I doubt if anybody knowingly, processed a PPP loan for a cannabis related business. But Steve, I think you've found a few of them, haven't you?
Yeah, even before we did our analysis, there was a handful of headlines around, I'm going to use the words hemp and CBD related cannabis companies. And I think you have some thoughts about SBA and cannabis, but we did bump up the entire list of loans against my database of direct MRBs and found somewhere between 100 and 600. We're still working through all of the potential matches, but I would say safely 100 right now appear to be direct marijuana related MRBs that receive PPP loans. It happens, right? There was hundreds of thousands of loans, but I'll just say at the least it happens, and it is happening. And I doubt I'm sure none of the financial institutions knowingly did so, but that again is the point, is knowingly and well defined.
Knowingly and unknowingly.
Or again, I don't get in my soapbox, or it's knowingly, I don't bank marijuana knowingly, right? So I also didn't check any of my strip malls in the Denver MSA either to see if any of them actually do have that 1 in 20 client. So that's a challenge.
I'm always interested when we do these sessions, how many people are then going, "Ooh, yeah, didn't think about that one," and are hurrying up and typing in all the strip malls that they've ever worked with directly.
It's not, it's not rocket science. It's cross-referencing. It's the same practice that's already been used in other areas or other ways for the institution. It's identifying risk, boxing out the risk. Institutions I know who maybe start with no marijuana policy end up finding that they have some of these accounts, and they have the choice of closing them down or maybe giving them what I might call amnesty, right? And saying, okay, well, maybe this is the impetus to start doing a little bit with this high net worth guy or gal or family that I really like and I don't want to lose. Maybe that's where we start. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I think, Jim, on that note, right, certainly as we talk about the PPP loans, that, a result of the COVID environment. And I don't think that this is, certainly marijuana businesses, we're not exempt from, any impact of COVID. So certainly this is one impact that we've seen, and certainly I guess that's a takeaway, right? Remember, there's an extra level of due diligence that has to happen for some of these things. But what other impacts do you think that we'll see, directly related to marijuana-related businesses that COVID has had or is having?
I think that one of the things that we see on sort of the monitoring side is because of the closure of so many cash-intensive businesses, nail salons, restaurants, things like that. A lot of financial institutions have seen those businesses essentially shut down, and that cash essentially shut down. And a lot of those businesses were used, for money laundering purposes, right? I know DEA has reported that they've been seizing more and more cash because there's just nowhere to put it into the system. But marijuana businesses have generally been allowed to remain open. And have still been running through a lot of cash. So there's just been some interesting kind of dichotomies when it comes to the impact of COVID and the shutdowns of the various cash-intensive businesses, when one of the biggest cash-intensive industries, which is cannabis, has generally remained open. And Sunday, you guys have probably seen some of the shifts in the flows of cash with your clients.
We've seen the industry continue to grow. I think there was the first month of adjustment there in April when everything went curbside and they tried to get rid of the cash on the curbs and that type of thing. And we saw a dip in April, and April is notorious for having a big increase due to their holiday in April. 421, right? And so we see the manufacturers always get paid in March, and we see the retailers always get paid in April. So we always see a spike in business at that point in the year, which we didn't really get this year, I think probably because of all the closures. But just to give you an example, in February and March, we were probably processing $235 million, and we processed $285 million just this last month. So there's absolutely not only, performance sustained in the cannabis industry, it continues to grow, which I think we can all go back and relate to those types of businesses that do well in recessionary times, alcohol, tobacco, and I think cannabis has proven, at least by our observation and how our companies have performed, to be one of those companies that industries that will sustain itself through good times and bad times.
All right. So Sunday, on that note, given, it's remained consistent, there was really, just maybe a small drop, and it continues to grow in the COVID, environment. You mentioned it earlier that I found was interesting, right? Given it's had a negative impact on some institutions and looking for new ways to make up revenue, it allows for you to enter new markets that you traditionally hadn't entered before or were choosing not to enter. Have you seen that, especially as it relates to the marijuana-related businesses?
I have seen two types of reactions on financial institutions. Either they run and they hide, and I'm not taking on any more risk at this point in time, which we can understand after living through the Great Recession, or they take the opportunity and they say, I know I'm going to need a new line of business. And there's two ways of going about that. And I just really want to caution people, maybe this is another takeaway. I see some financial institutions who want to jump straight into lending, right? Let's bypass depository services, go straight to lending. That's the market we all really want. After all, it's the bread and butter of financial institutions out there. But the fact of the matter is, they don't really know their customer. We recently launched a lending program after, in our 6th year of actually doing cannabis banking. And the reason we didn't launch it is because neither the regulators were comfortable, nor did we know our businesses. But we're making loans to customers we know. We know their cash flow. We know their beneficial owners. We know the performance history of these companies to which we will make loans. So I would say that those people who are jumping in to take advantage of the market and starting with lending, you know, if they're going to participate those loans out, I would say beware those loans, because you need to make sure that somewhere those funds that are going to repay those loans are coming from legitimate businesses. And how do you know that, except you know there is a compliant cannabis banking relationship? So the best way to move into lending is to move through depository services, learn the industry, know what you're banking, and then you'll have a better idea about lending.
I'm seeing, to follow that up, Cindy, and this is what I'm hearing. You and I have spoken about, I think, about this a little bit as well, but it's worth noting what I'm seeing, and correct me if I'm wrong, Cindy, what I think she's seen is this is related to all this conversation, but we are generally seeing more financial institutions, obviously a lot more compared to when she started in 2015, a lot more financial institutions in the space. So you're actually seeing price competition and price compression on the non-interest income related to cannabis banking now in multiple states. So I realize, you know, cannabis or marijuana is still definitely cash intensive and quote unquote underbanked relative to non-illegal industries. But I think there's an overall increase in competition for those cannabis deposits, as well as the lending is what I'm seeing, you know, from my seat that's farther away than Sunday's, but that's what I'm seeing and hearing. It's worth noting.
Yeah, and I think people need to understand that if you take money service businesses, check cashers, money remitters, et cetera, they've been federally legal, federally licensed, regulated, and examined for 15 plus years. And many financial institutions choose not to bank MSBs. So even if the chips fall where they should in November, and we have a completely different federal regulatory regime, it's going to be 10 or 15 years before I think that there's a big take-up of the cannabis industry by sort of the larger mainstream financial institutions. And even when they do, it'll still be cash intensive, higher risk, and the programs that people like Sunday have put together are really going to be the model for going forward. It's going to be high risk for as long as I'm around.
It's interesting, Jim, that you mentioned MSBs. It's funny, I guess if I relate this, right, we probably all were on a panel at some point in time talking about the risk around MSBs and choosing to do business with versus not. I don't know if maybe I just aged myself there, but nonetheless, it's very familiar narrative. So we're coming up on time, and I know we've already done a few of these different takeaways. So thank you for that. But I do want to make sure we get another round and ask everybody to just give a couple of key takeaways as the audience leaves here thinking about what we've said today, and as they look at their own business, just some things that maybe they can put into practice. So I'm just going to go around the horn. Let's start with Steve.
Yeah, my takeaways are pretty consistent, I think, historically. Words matter, so when you're thinking about serving or not serving the cannabis industry, quote unquote, you have clear definitions, clear policies, clear, and based on those, what you're going to do, what you weren't going to do. As Jim was saying, whether it's to serve or provide services to or products, just be clear and have clear procedures. I think it's going to be the inconsistencies that are going to get the some financial institutions saying, well, or misapplying or applying policies differently given a different scenario or a different person. So I think that's the risk. I think to some way, Jim kind of said this, I think we're still pretty darn early overall, even though I've been working at this 5 or 6 years. So Sunday, we have 10, 15, 20 years, I think, before we reach some level of normalization or equilibrium whatever you want to call it. And that's just in the United States. You know, take everything we're talking about at the US level and magnify that across the globe, because you have the same problem internationally as well.
Yeah. So Sundi, I know you don't have to rehash all of your key points, but if you can give just a couple takeaways, that'd be great.
Sure. Couple of thoughts there. I think the first one is do your homework and put a business plan together. And people probably always wonder, why do a business plan? It's just a line of business. And I often tell people that you're going to run into so many new things. You want to have the basics in place, in order, so your staff knows how to respond to them. And again, it goes back to protecting the board, that they have a business plan and that they know what you're doing, because it's really part of the requirements. The second thing I'd like to touch on is slow and methodical. You know, I think that the reason we have succeeded year over year over year is that we learned one risk at a time. We mitigated it. We drafted the procedures. We taught and trained staff. And people, I have heard some of these technology companies like to refer to safe harbor private banking as the dinosaur. I like to refer to us as the turtle. But we will get there. And we will get there in a slow, steady pace that keeps our financial institutions safe and sound, and not put everybody else at risk by putting a bad program out there. So I think slow and methodical is really worth considering. If you're trying to get market share and get income really quickly, you're probably going down the wrong road, and you're going to cut corners, and it's not going to be pretty in the end for you.
Great. So Jim?
Well, Sundi, you're neither a turtle nor a dinosaur. You're the gold standard. So, and I applaud your courage and your persistence in the way you've done it. I think you're a model for the entire industry. But I would say document. It's unlikely anything horrible is going to happen to a financial institution that is knowingly, actively providing known financial services to a known customer base with a well-documented program. But the last thing you want is for your directors to say to a federal prosecutor, I had no idea that we were knowingly violating federal law by banking cannabis businesses. You just don't want that to happen, guys. So document it. You know, you spoke to the board. You turned to each director in turn and said, if we do this, do you understand we are knowingly violating federal law? Now, the likelihood of getting caught and prosecuted is almost zero, but document that. Document every decision, every policy, every procedure. Document.
Fantastic. So I think that's been a common theme. I hope everybody at least walks away with that. Make sure that you have the right level of documentation as you progress forward into this space. So look, I think that was great insight. I really appreciate this panel. Thank you all for attending. The good news is we're going to open up this session now to questions. So you'll have the ability now, if you can just put your questions in and submit them. You have all of us here, and we'll be happy to answer them. And we're looking forward to the Q&A session. Hi, everyone. We're going to jump right into our Q&A session. We've got quite a few questions coming in via the chat. Feel free to keep those questions coming in, and we're going to get to as many of them as we can. We'll try to follow up post-session once if we can't get to all the questions. So we're going to kind of go down the list. So the first question, Sundi, I'm going to pose this one to you. In which states are transfers related to the cannabis business allowed? And I'm going to make that two parts because there's quite a few other questions about international. So can you talk to us a little bit about states and then international?
Sure. Thanks, Holly. It's a good question. So first, you have to distinguish between the type of money that you're talking about, whether it's cannabis and strictly marijuana related, derived from the sales of marijuana, because cannabis can also be referred in terms of CBD and hemp and other factors, or ancillary. So you've got to determine what kind of money, and hemp and CBD obviously have some federal legalization where cannabis doesn't. So I'm going to speak more to cannabis at this point in time. You have to take a look at the home state in which money is being transferred to a financial institution. So let's take Idaho as an example, and nothing is legal. Neither medicinal nor adult use cannabis is legal in Idaho. So therefore, they consider that an illegal product and the proceeds from the sale of that product illegal as well. So how can one financial institution, even if they're branched into Colorado, take that money back to its home state without violating that state's wishes on the illegality position? It's simple. If the product is illegal, the money is illegal. If the product is legal, the money is legal. On an international level, this even gets a little more tricky. We have, and what you should know is that a lot of our MSO clients, our multi-state operator clients, are going international. We get requests all the time to open accounts in Colombia, South America, and Greece and Europe. They're doing business all over, but the thing of it is, again, and Canada being right next door to us, the thing of that is you cannot place funds over international borders that are derived from the sale of cannabis, because international treaties are very specific about this. And it is a Schedule I on an international level. Now, the World Health Organization is working on this right now because this is happening. So if issues are going across, the question is, what type of money is going across? If we're getting a lot of money in, and we do, from international locations, this is investment money. We have to make sure that money is not tied to the sale of cannabis. And likewise, when money is going back to Canada, we got to make sure it's not tied to the sales of cannabis. So what do? They know we won't pass money over the international borders to other countries that derive from the sale of cannabis. So they opened 3 Delaware companies between our bank and credit union and the mother holding company in Canada, and they pass those funds through 3 Delaware companies going up the chain. I would guess that we could consider those hidden accounts in several banks, and the money is moving through those hidden accounts, moving up and back to the investors, because somehow the investors have to get the money back.
Great. Thank you. So I'm going to be cognizant of time and jump to our next question. So Jim, I'm going to direct this one over to you. How are companies that offer services to marijuana businesses effective? And what is the impact do you see on banking?
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, I think that these are your classic tier 2 companies, those that generate some or all of their revenue from marijuana or cannabis, but aren't actually licensed marijuana cannabis businesses. I think Sunday said it earlier, these businesses are in fact, in many respects, riskier than the licensed businesses. They are not as tightly regulated as the licensed businesses are. And so it's risky to serve them, and it's often riskier not to serve them in many respects. These are management companies, commercial landlords, they're going to be garden supply firms. The question is there common ownership with a licensed business? Are they managing the licensed business, but they're not licensed themselves? So there's a lot of issues, a lot of concerns. I know that a bunch of these firms are struggling to keep and maintain banking relationships. So for all the banks, credit unions out there that are not knowingly actively banking cannabis businesses, look really, really carefully at these tier 2 businesses. They're probably riskier in many respects than the licensed ones.
Great, thank you, Jim. So there's a couple of questions, and Sunday, you commented on it earlier when you were talking about kind of cross-border. But Steve, I know this is a topic you're passionate about. So there's a couple questions here about CBD, right? The difference between banking and marijuana-related businesses, and then how does that translate as you're starting to look at CBD? Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd say it's one of my favorite, but it just comes up so often I'm used to answering it. Just to first of all clarify, based on the question as written, CBD, there is one approved, FDA approved CBD medicine. It's called Epidiolex, or I always mispronounce it, Epidiolex, which is basically pure CBD. It is an FDA reviewed and approved drug. It is the only CBD approved drug. It requires a prescription, specific medical uses. So it's worth understanding or clarifying that the issue with CBD is less about marijuana scheduling than about general FDA rules and regulations around drugs and medicine. Since CBD via Epidiolex, which is just a brand name for CBD, is already approved as a drug, you are not allowed to use drugs in food, beverages. You aren't allowed to make basically bootleg drugs, like ibuprofen is an unscheduled drug, but you still need to be a approved pharmaceutical manufacturer of that drug. So if you're thinking about CBD in that light, it makes a little bit more sense. It's like, would you go buy ibuprofen, from a barrio or gas station? You don't really know where it came from. So the overall concern is less marijuana, less cannabis than it is CBD is already FDA reviewed and approved drug. So there's issues around using that. It's also not that the FDA, a lot of people in industry, CBD and hemp, are waiting for the FDA to quote unquote clarify the position on CBD. It's not so much that they want FDA to clarify, it's that they want the FDA to change its position from CBD as a drug to CBD as not a drug. All this being said, there's obviously numerous CBD manufacturers and retailers out there. Despite my personal opinion about CBD being relatively high risk, even we have banks, I have clients who bank the space, but they frankly go and get a legal opinion from someone who maybe knows FDA law, drug law better than Steve Kemmerling does. So, it is tricky because it is an FDA, it's a drug thing. It's correlated or related to marijuana given the nature of where it came from. But overall, correct me if I'm wrong, Sunny, but CBD is a relatively high risk industry that you can't just say hemp's legal, therefore CBD is legal. That's a gross oversimplification.
Thanks, Steve. And I knew we were going to run out of time with Q&A, and we have quite a few questions, so we'll try to catch up and answer some of those post-event so that you can reach out so that we can at least answer a few of those questions. So thank you, everyone, for attending. Thank you to our speakers. We very much appreciate having your expertise on this panel. For everybody in attendance, during the break, please join the exhibitors in the virtual exhibit hall. Also, if you wouldn't mind rating the session and the speakers in the evaluation link, that would be great. And sessions will resume in 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone.